my name is Sasha.
My name is Maya.
And my name is Freya.
And today we're going to be talking about Jacob Lawrence's Bar and Grill, originating from 1941, and its historical context and engagement with racial segregation. We're also going to compare it to Norman Rockwell's New Kids in the Neighborhood from 1967 to examine how depictions of race evolved over time.
For sure, he was born in New Jersey, but he moved to Harlem when he was 13. You can kind of see that through his work, that he lived through a great period of racial tension in Harlem specifically. And he talks a lot about how he's inspired by the Harlem Renaissance. I think you can also see that in his work. He's kind of referred to as one of the most successful African-American artists, especially of this time. And he became the first African-American artist to be acquired by MoMA.
I think his work is really engaged. You can see how important his culture and his heritage is to him. Rothery said that he wasn't born in the South, but he has the South in him because it's from his grandmother, and you can see how culture is really important in that community.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your thoughts on how segregation is kind of presented through this piece through its visual language. For me personally, what stood out was the rigid separation division in the painting, separated by a wall. The left cannot access the right, and they're also separated by skin color.
Yeah, it's really brutal. It's a complete separation. It's not just ideological, and often in scholarly talks and stuff, separations are thought of as ideological, and it's all theoretical concept. And in this one, it's just super obvious and super bland. It's literally a wall.
Yeah, I think something I noticed was the way that it skews. The lines that he uses are really interesting. They kind of remind me of Cubism, in a little way. And the flatness too of the work, especially the use of gouache. For me, it really mats it down and makes it very flat. To me, it's interesting that it juts in to the space of the African Americans, and it almost makes it seem smaller, and it's getting smaller, and it's encroaching on the Black individuals there. I think that's definitely one way you can see how he expresses that sort of pressure and the kind of nihilism that you really experience in that kind of situation.
It's more of a figurative piece, and you kind of wonder, what is the point of the piece? What was the goal of the artist? Was it to make a perfect representational piece, or was it to have a deeper meaning? And with that, I think that he really utilized semiotics by situating the people in a bar. The goal of the painting was the separation and division rather than depiction of a person.
The fact that it's not oil on canvas also speaks to the realities of segregated individuals, and the fact that they had less access to education and to what was considered high art. Yeah, but I don't think it makes it less important or less good art. It's just more reflective and actually more engaged with the actual context of the community.
I also thought what was interesting was the way he does depict the figures. The faces of the white people are very almost hostile. There's sort of a furrowed brow and very little detail. And the detail that he does include are the whites of the eyes are sort of yellow, and almost the people in there are sick. And it's a sort of maybe a nod to a sick society too, because the Black individuals also have the same kind of yellowed eyes and odd shape of their bodies. And yeah, I think that there he's really showing that the world that he's living in is sick. And I think the bar setting is interesting because it's something that he probably did experience in reality. And I think that just a huge portion of Black individuals experience that exact situation where they're in a bar and they're supposed to be in one side. So the sort of placing it in reality, but also really skewing it, yeah, it really lends itself to that idea.
I like what you said, kind of how it represents like this harsh reality. So like in real time, the Jim Crow laws was seen as separate but equal. And in this painting, it just doesn't feel that way. It's this contrast between this idea that you're equal yet separate, but in the painting, nothing feels equal.
What is also striking is that it's not a depiction of black people fighting back. Like you see the woman or like the one of the black figures is actually like head down and like one is smoking and two are dancing, but like the fact that we don't see any of their features, it sort of ties down into the context of the 40s where the civil rights protests were not like really there actually. So it starts more in the 50s, but like the roots of those movements are there. So like the fact that there is a painting depicting the reality, but we're not quite up to the point of actually fighting back and like taking up space.
I think to that point of it being a lot earlier in the sort of progression of the civil rights movement, it's interesting to read it as sort of this like nihilist interpretation of it. Like it's to them at that point, it felt as if there was no end because there was no fighting back. And when there's no end in sight, like how do you live through that if you think that's going to be the rest of your life?
I think this is a perfect segue into our piece that we're comparing it to, which is Norman Rockwell's New Kids in the Neighborhood from 1967. First of all, the date is different. It's about 20 years later, and we can kind of tell that the laws have slightly changed, or maybe there's a push towards desegregation.
Yeah, well, it depicts a bunch of kids looking at each other. So on one side, we have a couple of black kids who have presumably just moved in because there is a moving truck in the backdrop and furniture on the sidewalk. And then opposite them, there are three white kids who are being curious about them. So they have their baseball attire and they're just like looking at the kids, maybe inviting them to play as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at that versus the Lawrence painting and the difference in tone and optimism specifically. I feel like Norman Rockwell's, like you said, is that American dream and ending that divide. And I think that definitely comes with the later time period in which it was painted, where the civil rights movement was pretty much in full swing in the 1960s.
You made a point about how the division, like there are still some elements of division present, like the lines in the sidewalk and the truck and the stuff.
He's sort of like visually separating the two spaces of the black and white people in the same way.
Unlike Jacob Lawrence's work, those divisions are overcomable. But
they're not physically separated. They're also like approaching each other.
Yeah. And the fact that, like, even if you consider, like, the line in the sidewalk as something dividing them, like, you can step over a line in the sidewalk, unlike you cannot, like, step over a wall.
Mm-hmm. I also think the fact that he's painting them as, like, kids sort of interacting is sort of like him talking about, like, a hopeful future, whereas Lawrence's is in a bar and like thinking about the people who are in bars, and he sort of painted them as like their movements sort of suggest like of a frivolous nature, like they're drinking. And
I think the background of Norman Rockwell is pretty interesting because he was an illustrator beforehand, illustrating like idealized American families in like magazine covers, and then he shifted towards more like social justice themes because it was so like prevalent during these times. And something that kind of stands out to me, like the question is more, if Norman Rockwell wasn't a white person and if he was a black person, would he still be depicting like optimism?
Yeah.
Like when you look at Lawrence's painting, like there is no optimism there because it's a lived experience.
Yeah, I think like just because Jacob Lawrence really did experience growing up during the Jim Crow era and also like in Harlem, which is like a center of a lot of these issues. Him actually experiencing that and feeling it and living through it and being excluded, versus Norman Rockwell, who is witnessing it for sure. And I'm not saying that he's not sympathetic towards it, but he can't experience the true grief and horror that Black individuals experience, and he never will. And so his painting is sort of, it leaves out that sort of dark underbelly of what those people really experience and how it shouldn't really be something that you just move on from, like he's sort of suggesting in his painting with like the children, or maybe to him like it's that's the idealized version of what happens. It's just like, oh, let's just forget it and like let's just be friends, like let's have our kids be friends. But in reality, a lot of Black individuals can't forget that, and it's ingrained in their culture and their family systems. So yeah, I think there's a big difference in tone, especially like relating to their race and who they were and their backgrounds.
What I wonder when comparing the two pieces is what's more efficient in communicating your point. So in Lawrence's painting, to a person that doesn't really understand art and visual language, it may be more difficult to get to the understanding that it's a painting about segregation. Versus when you look at Rockwell's painting, it's a clear depiction because of its realistic like quality to it. Even with this like point of optimism, like is it more effective to kind of depict optimism and realism in the same painting?
I was gonna say, I think that they definitely, like, the two different paintings serve a different function. Like you said, because Norman Rockwell's paintings are so accessible and they have this like true heart to them about the American dream. I think like if anyone were to look at that, especially white people, they view it as like, oh yeah, I agree with that. It's like a point for them to agree with. Whereas I think that Jacob Lawrence's it's less accessible. You know, it's uncomfortable. It's not aesthetically pleasing, and it's flat, and it definitely speaks to a lot more different styles that are less accessible to the public. And I think he's not necessarily trying to get people to be on board with him. He's just trying to explain and show the like lived experience. Like when you view that, you feel isolated along with those people. You're right in the middle of the divide, you know, and you can see both sides. And so I think like it's just a matter of function of the paintings, you know.
Definitely. Jacob Lawrence aims more to express a certain anger and bitterness at unfair laws, whereas Norman Rockwell presumably was intended for a white audience or a more general audience. And like as we've said before, he is not Black, so he could not have depicted the interiority of a Black individual. In that way, they definitely differ.
Yeah, I think Rockwell's painting is very illustrative. He really does use symbolism as well. And so the Black children are carrying the white cat, and then the white children are carrying the black dog. Mm-hmm. So I think that it captures not necessarily like what the future will be like. I think it's like on the brink of change.
But I think obviously society is always changing. And although it might have been a progression back then, or at least in terms of how we're looking at it, where one's 20 years before the other one and the tones really changed, I think that we're kind of in a weird period of history where it's not really linear. Like progression is not linear. And I mean, we're like living through a real like downturn of human rights. The progression we've made to be more inclusive, especially in industries and especially for Black people, has actually like reversed. And so I think that sometimes the things that seem to us like they're really set in stone and like it makes sense can be ripped away from us by certain governments.
Absolutely. I think with all of that, we can successfully say that Lawrence's painting is definitely a painting of segregation and divide, kind of depicting this real lived experience. And with that, I think it's important for us to kind of question, like, what is the purpose of these arts and like, what's the purpose of an artist in society.
I think that's a good point to leave it at.
Thanks for watching!